So now it's time to integrate some full screen functionality. Now for this, there are in fact two ways that we can do this. We can full screen the entire document, which really we want to use the document element, which gives us our HTML. Now, we're going to start with this approach, so we're going to full screen our entire web page. But because we're integrating something like a video, it probably makes sense that we can also full screen the video itself rather than the entire document. It's a bit more user-friendly and probably a bit more appropriate. But first, I want to definitely teach you both of these approaches, and you can then use whichever you like for your next project. Now, first off, we want to target our player __ full screen. So let's jump inside here and say const full screen equals, and we can then use our player .query selector and then go and grab that player __ full screen. So this is going to return us our nice DOM node. We can then say console.log, log out our full screen. We can then go back to our console and we have our button. So the reason that we're doing this up front is because we cannot just activate full screen mode as soon as we land on the page. It has to come from a user's gesture, i.e. a click event. So we're in fact going to bind a click event to our full screen. We can say add event listener and then bind that click. So inside this function, we can then say that we want to request the full screen mode. Now for this, we're going to use document.document element. Now if you've never seen this before or never used it, that's essentially going to give us the entire document. Document element simply refers to the very base element, the HTML tag. Now because of the way that the full screen API works, we need to essentially tell it, depending on what element that we are talking to, that we want to request this full screen mode. So you can see here, if I type request, we then have request picture in picture, which we've used before, and we also have request full screen. Displays an element full screen and resolves a promise when it's done. So here we have it displays an element full screen and resolves a promise when it is finished. We can then say .then, we can then say inside console log done, and we can also supply another argument, which is going to be console.log rejected. So this is if the full screen request was in fact rejected. So let's go and click, and you can see that we immediately enter our full screen mode, and we also have this done in our console. We can then go back to the document, so we can click on anywhere up here. Be sure that you're not in the actual console because it's not going to work if we then press escape. But you can see that we have this request full screen, which then gives us a promise. We don't necessarily need to do this. We can actually use it on its own without using a promise if you just want to do something more simple like this. I quite like the promise syntax, and it's completely up to you which you want to use. What we could do is in fact change this over to an async await pattern. So we could say that we want to try the document. So we're going to try and enter the full screen. Otherwise, we're going to catch whatever error it gives us, and we can say console warn that particular error out, and the return value, we could say const OK equals, and we can then log out this OK value. So if we hit our full screen mode, you can see that we have this promise. So this actually gives us that promise that we want to now await. So when we then await it, we then get an undefined value. And this is just simply because the promise has resolved OK. If there was in fact an error, we wouldn't be able to execute any further code. So we don't really need to run any code or assign any return values. We can just simply await that full screen request. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you, and that is simply going to be logged out in the console. So we can say document.fullScreen. Now we have this full screen enabled, which we've already looked at. We've then feature detected it, but we also have this full screen element. So if we save this out, what I'm going to do actually is just duplicate this, and we'll add it above and below. So we'll save this out, we'll enter full screen mode. We then have null, and then we have our HTML tag. So this in fact is our full screen element before, as you can see, it's on line 192, 192, 194 is then after gives us our HTML tag. So whenever, and this is an important thing to remember, whenever we are in full screen mode, we do have a full screen element which is then assigned from the value of null to whatever element is then holding that full screen mode. So that's it for this lesson. This is the nice way that we can use the request full screen promise, and we can use a nice async and await syntax. We can catch any errors, We can use the try statement. If everything is then okay, our code will then keep executing. Otherwise, we could put a pop-up or something to the user that says full screen failed or something like this. For instance, if we are on a mobile device, this isn't going to work. It needs to be a desktop. And we've also learned about this full screen element, so then we can detect whether we've entered full screen mode. We've also got some events to come with it. But first, in the next lesson, we're going to then tie it to our media object, so we can just full screen our video like so, which I think is a much better use case for our full screen API.